All right. Well, good morning. Welcome. Well, at least we can see the beautiful blue skies through the upper windows anyway, and you'll be getting out of here before the day ends, so you can enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Maybe play hooky, go to the fair, and have something fried, or not. Anyway, good. But I'm Keith Poston. I am the president and executive director of the Public School Forum of North Carolina. Thank you for being here, and welcome to the kickoff of Study Group 16. Now, you'll see on the screen here on Twitter, that is hashtag SGXVI. So if you're going to be tweeting, and we encourage it, and Joe, I think, will give a little bit of information. We do have a Wi-Fi password and access here, so you should be all set there. You are going to be part of something special, not just today, but over the next few months. Now, some of you may be very familiar. In fact, I know we have a number of board members from the forum who've been involved in our study groups before, but study groups are something that the Public School Forum of North Carolina has done just about every other year since we opened our doors in 1986. We bring together representatives just like you from education, from government, from business, from nonprofits, from community organizations, and representatives from across the state, representing all sorts of perspectives and views and expertise to tackle important issues in education. Over the years, these study groups have studied things such as teacher recruitment and retention. We've looked at digital learning. We've looked at learning and accountability and assessments. We've looked at school finance, international competitiveness, the importance of after-school and out-of-school learning. So it's been something that has been a part of us for a long time. Our very first study group was in 1985-86. It was actually part of how we were formed. This is actually a copy of the report that was published in 1986, Who Will Teach Our Children? It's a proposal to recruit quality teachers for tomorrow's schools, and it led to the creation of the North Carolina Teaching Fellows Program in 1986, which put more than 8,000 teachers into public school classrooms in all 100 counties of North Carolina. So our study groups have made a real impact, both in policy and in practice of education in North Carolina. Now, this study group, your study group, is going to be no exception, in my opinion. I can't think of any issue facing us today that is more significant than educational opportunity, and how can we truly ensure that all North Carolina children, regardless of race or background, station, have the opportunity for a sound basic education. Now, of course, that language is very familiar to most of you. That is, of course, enshrined in our state's constitution. Ann McCall, who will be speaking in a little while, I'm sure we'll mention in that a time or two. It also became a central statement in what is simply known now as Leandro, that continues to be litigated. We actually had a study group in 2004, 2005. I actually have a copy of that one too. This was how the state should respond to the Leandro ruling. Judge Howdy Manning actually read from this report when he opened his last hearing just a couple of months ago, and in fact he sort of pondered whether we were still 10 years later at the same place we were when this report was written in 2005. Now, I'm sorry he couldn't be here today. I think probably most of you know Judge Manning suffered a stroke in late August. He's doing okay. He's actually still recuperating. In fact, when he called me, he sounded more annoyed that it was slowing him down than anything else. But he assures me that he will be ready for the next Leandro hearing, which is scheduled for November. But this study group is not going to be Leandro Study Group Part 2. Frankly, the principles of Leandro, in our opinion at the forum, are still very valid, that for an opportunity for a sound basic education, children need excellent teachers, they need capable school leaders, and they need adequate resources. So there's really no point in sort of going back and saying, well, are those the right things, because we believe they are still the right things. We're going to examine the rest of the story of what's going on in North Carolina. Today in North Carolina, we have schools in parts of our state that are more segregated than they were in the 60s. Today, we have a state that we have more than 500,000 children who are living in poverty. 25% of the children in this state live in poverty. And we know poverty correlates strongly with academic achievement. In fact, I can think of at least one good thing that our new A to F school performance grades have done, and that is accomplished, and that's laying out clearly for everyone to see. You probably have seen these statistics. Joe Oblidinger, who you'll meet in a second, wrote a really good piece a few months back called A is for Affluent, but we talked about the fact that there's not a single school in North Carolina serving 85% or more low-income students that received an A, and only 2 that earned Bs. Conversely, schools that have less than 25% low income, 95% of them received A's or B's. We also know that poorer North Carolina counties with fewer taxable resources, even with higher tax rates than counties like here in Wake or in Mecklenburg or in Guilford, have difficulty generating the kind of revenue to support public schools. The 7 lowest spending counties in North Carolina combined spend as much on schools as Orange County does by itself. We also know, I mentioned the segregation and some of the issues we have with race, just to give you a couple of examples that have been in the press. In Mecklenburg County, 49% of black students attend high poverty schools, while only 6% of white students do. Here in Wake County, since 2008, the number of schools where at least 70% of the students are receiving subsidized lunches has gone from 0 to 12 schools, just since 2008. So we have a lot to dig into. But that's what our study groups have done for nearly 30 years. And really that's what North Carolina has done, and for much longer. We speak the truth, we set high goals, we bring people together, we tackle important things. I had a really great opportunity this week. Some of you, Mike Priddy and Bruce Beasley, were with me at an event over at NC State, and I saw a documentary that WUNC-TV produced called A Generation of Change. In fact, I should make sure that we send out a link to everyone because I think you would get a lot out of it. One segment in it really struck me. This was about our leaders in North Carolina that between 1920 and 1972, but really about the leaders that came around after World War II and what happened in North Carolina from that period in World War II up until the early 70s. In January of 1963, then Governor Terry Sanford spoke on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. He said at that time that we needed a second Emancipation Proclamation in North Carolina because it was clear that black children in this state were not being provided the educational opportunities necessary to claim their own future and the promise of freedom. And that's pretty amazing when you think about it. This was a white Southern governor in 1963. Now, our governor, I mean, that's pretty cool. It's even more amazing when the documentary went on to point out that when he made that speech, 4 days before he made that speech, George Wallace was inaugurated as governor of Alabama and made his now infamous declaration, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. I mean, as a native North Carolina, it made me proud and reinforced what I always believed, that this state is special and different and that we approach things differently. As we were settling on the topic for this study group, our program director, James Ford, who I'm going to be inviting up here in just a minute along with Joe, he emailed me a link to a radio broadcast that some of you probably heard. It was This American Life. It was a public radio piece. It was entitled The Problem We All Live With. It's a powerful segment about the state of integration in our public schools today. So he sent me that. I think that was a Thursday. Then that weekend, the same weekend, the Tampa Tribune ran a story. It was jarring, about 5 elementary schools in the Tampa area that 10 years ago were integrated, thriving, successful elementary schools. And following changes, assignment changes in that district, those same 5 schools became poor, they became racially isolated, and today are 5 of the worst performing schools in the state of Florida. And that happened in 10 years. That same weekend, the Atlantic Magazine ran a story on the disparate funding for schools based on race. And then at that Sunday, in the News and Observer, there was a piece on the growing body of research on the impact of toxic stress and trauma on childhood learning. So all those things this is when we were sort of circling around of where we were going to go with this. And so I emailed James that Sunday, and I said, do you ever feel like you're in the exact right place at the exact right time to do something you're supposed to do? Now, I have to say, James emailed back and said, yep, the day I accepted your offer to join us, so I appreciate that. But I think you are here today at the right place at the right time to do something you're supposed to do. So let's get started. James Ford, our program director, Joel Bleidinger, I'll bring you up.
Thanks, Keith. And thank you to all of you for joining us to kick off Study Group 16. First, a few logistics, bathrooms out the door to the left. And for those of you who are on Twitter, our handle is the NC Forum. And as Keith mentioned, for Study Group 16, we'll be using hashtag SGXVI. In your packets on the left-hand side, you'll find bios of our study group co-chairs, the committee co-chairs, and today's presenter, Ann McCall. On the right-hand side, you'll find a copy of today's agenda and a one-page copy of a narrative that James will be referencing in just a few minutes. Taking a look at our agenda, this morning is an opportunity to establish a common foundation for all study group participants. A foundation rooted in history, but built to support us in forging a new path at a new historical moment. And after lunch, we'll be getting a glimpse of each of the 3 study group committees and how that work will be proceeding. Here on the screen, you see a visual of our plans for Study Group 16. After today, each of our 3 committees on racial equity, trauma and learning, and low-performing schools will meet 3 to 4 times from November through March, after which our staff at the Forum, under the guidance of our co-chairs and with opportunities for all of you to contribute, critique, comment, will produce a report that will be produced and released in April. This April timing is set so that at the start of the legislature's short session, we might be a part of discussions about policy changes that might come through in the coming months. But our recommendations will not all pertain to policy. At the Forum, we recently announced the creation of a new Center for Educational Opportunity. And that center will be the hub for new programmatic activity and partnership to operationalize the study group's recommendations beginning in the spring. Some of you expressed an interest in school funding as well, and on that score, the Forum will be starting a separate school funding working group next month that will proceed on a different timetable with recommendations coming out in January 2017. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to James Ford, the program director here at the Forum and former North Carolina Teacher of the Year, to talk about the study group's rationale and narrative.
I'm going to try very hard to contain my level of excitement. I did not sleep last night, partially because I recognized the pregnancy of potential that this moment has. And we're going to talk about the rationale for this particular study group, but I need you to recognize that there's a level of human, intellectual, institutional capital in this room that even if we didn't have an agenda, I'm certain something great will come out of here because everybody brings something to the table. With that being said, we do want to focus our work, and in particular, focus on the 3, or at least explain the power of history while we're here. As Keith did a good job of mentioning, we're at an impasse, and many of us, I think, in education are perhaps wondering what is next. And the truth is, we set the course. We determine that future. The conversations that will be had here, the ideas that are born out of that, and the actionable solutions that we develop will determine the next phase of educational history here in North Carolina. And so that's why we've chosen the 3 areas that we have: racial equity, trauma and learning, and low-performing schools are common themes that we see that tend to have a very tight correlation with academic performance all throughout the state of North Carolina. And so that's why we've chosen those particular committees. But in order to help personify this so that it's not something that just exists in the abstract, I would like to read for you a narrative about a student named Antonio, so that as we work our way through all the various conversations over the better part of this year, that you keep Antonio in mind as we think and develop new solutions. Antonio is an energetic, imaginative, and rambunctious 8-year-old African-American boy from Rocky Mount, North Carolina. He is naturally inquisitive and loves learning new things. Like most little boys, he struggles at times to stay composed and on task. His need for physical activity and incessant questioning could easily be misinterpreted as acting out. Such is often the case. Not even halfway through the 3rd grade, Antonio has already been suspended twice, both times for disruptive behavior. The first incident was the result of a heated argument with another student that got Antonio worked up to the point he emotionally shut down. He folded his arms, ignored several commands from his teacher, and would not speak to any of the faculty as tears streamed down his face. The second was the result of, quote, playing too roughly, end quote, with fellow students during recess. The suspension came after he had been warned several times by his teacher. This overly punitive response is not surprising, as there are racial gaps in discipline throughout the district and state. These sort of incidences are not uncommon at Antonio's elementary school. Nash Rocky Mount Schools has been labeled one of the state's lowest performing school districts. Most of its schools earn D and F school grades, which are based in large part on student scores on end-of-grade tests. Antonio's school happens to be included in that number. It received an F grade and failed to meet expected growth during 2014-15. Suspensions are high while achievement remains low. It is a high-poverty school, overwhelmingly non-white, full of mostly young and inexperienced teachers that struggle to manage the workload and population. It is increasingly hard to keep teachers as they often opt for larger districts offering more pay and leave the profession altogether. Despite the tensions that exist there, school is a safe place for Antonio, a pillar of stability where he knows he will see his friends and be around caring adults. He is one of 4 children being raised by a loving, hardworking single mother. His father, though around, is not a reliable fixture in his life. Like so many of his peers, his housing situation is rarely permanent or even long-lasting. His family moves around frequently, often landing them in the midst of extreme poverty and violence. Though he idolizes his older siblings, they often expose him to inappropriate behavior. His mother cannot always be present as she works 2 jobs, 1 and 2nd shift. He is not alone, as this is the case with many of his peers. No one at his school knows the details of Antonio's life outside of school and understands the connections to his in-school behavior. Antonio and so many other students all over North Carolina represent the most vulnerable students in our state, students of color who have experienced trauma and attend low-performing schools. This is why we've chosen the 3 focus areas, because the children least likely to succeed too often find themselves in one or more of these 3 categories. As we work together in this study group to think about and design solutions to these ideas, we will constantly come back to this narrative. Ask yourself this fundamental question: what would it take to provide a child like Antonio with the opportunity to receive a sound basic education? As we think and design, we will be coming up with programmatic and policy solutions in 3 separate veins. In these compartments, I want you to think about policy changes or initiatives at the school level, things that can be enacted by school leaders and staff. Additionally, consider district solutions, things that can be employed by a LEA or a network of schools. And lastly, consider statewide solutions, things that can either be legislated by the General Assembly or adopted by the State Board of Education. These are the 3 compartments that we will be funneling all of our ideas and energies into.
It's now my pleasure, my honor, to introduce our distinguished Study Group 16 co-chairs. Dr. Mike Priddy is a retired North Carolina educator who served during his 35-year career in just about every leadership position that exists in the school systems in North Carolina. He started as a math teacher in Northampton County, then spent the bulk of his career in Guilford County before ending up as the superintendent of the Pitt County Schools in Greenville. I know he'll be sharing a bit about his varied experiences with you in just a minute. Dr. Dudley Flood began his career as a teacher as well, and then became a principal before being hired by the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction to lead the desegregation of the state's public schools. And since that time, Dr. Flood has been involved in desegregation efforts in 48 states. Both Dr. Priddy and Dr. Flood have remained extremely active in retirement. Both are on the forum's board of directors, which Dr. Priddy currently chairs, and both have been awarded the prestigious Order of the Longleaf Pine in addition to many, many other accolades. And so it is my pleasure to introduce to you and bring up Dr. Priddy and Dr. Flood.
Good morning. I've been invited to kick off this part of the program, and I'll do that. Before I get into my prepared remarks, though, can you just imagine the energy that we feel at the forum with this kind of work being undertaken? Keith Poston, Joe, James, they've already laid that out for you, but I just want to say it another time. When you look at this man, Dudley Flood, when you look out across this audience, and I wish to include myself here, as you will understand better after my remarks, we're at a crossroads in America, but more importantly, we're in North Carolina, and we can't afford to let this opportunity that we've created here for this discussion to not have the impact on the larger social conversation, the social justice conversation that needs to take place in North Carolina. Before I proceed into my formal remarks, let me ask everyone who's associated with the Public School Forum, the board, the membership, the staff, to raise your hand and let folks look around and see how many of us are here. Probably 20 was from my count. We have about 100 people involved in the board and the membership and the staff. And in one way or another, we anticipate every one of them will be involved. But more importantly, there are so many people here this morning, Keith, whom I don't recognize. And I've had the privilege of getting to know a lot of people in North Carolina. My hunch is there are a few in here that Dudley doesn't recognize. That says to me that there's a new opportunity for this conversation to take root and take legs, and we're here to have it. Thank you for being here. I did choose to write out my remarks because they're easily ones that could lead you astray. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to present them in a more formal way. As we begin our study group's work, I'd like to emphasize the importance of geography on educational opportunity. My career has brought this home for me, having grown up in Winston-Salem in the 1950s and 60s, and having served as a teacher and administrator in 7 school districts during my career. These 7 school districts represent stark contrasts. They are large and small, rich and poor, black and white, and are located in our eastern coastal plain and in the Piedmont. I also had opportunities to work with many of our state's 115 school districts when I served in the DPI as the liaison between the State Board of Education and the State Superintendent's Office, as well as during the past 10 years through my consulting work. I grew up in a middle-class family as the only child. My parents had completed high school but did not pursue college work. My mother had aunts who were teachers and librarians, and she admired them. My parents consistently emphasized the importance of education and a college degree. So after high school, I was off to UNC Chapel Hill in 1966. 15 years later, I was able to say that I had earned 3 degrees from Carolina. I enjoyed as much educational opportunity as anyone could have ever hoped to have. At the same time, during that 15-year period, I learned that issues of race, poverty, and politics dramatically impacted the lives of others my age that had not yet enjoyed the same educational opportunities that I had. And I might note that I took my opportunities for granted because, like most of us, we only know what we know. In 1969, I pursued an unexpected, fortuitous opportunity. I was invited to become a teacher of high school mathematics and social studies in a rural school district in northeastern North Carolina. This was the year of court-ordered desegregation in North Carolina and elsewhere in the South. The school district where I taught had been segregated prior to 1969. As a result of federal orders, private academies sprung up throughout North Carolina, especially in those counties with large percentages of blacks in relation to whites. These private schools generally siphoned off the white teachers who could afford reduced salaries and could lose the long-term benefits of the state's retirement system and health care system. Since my first day of teaching in 1969, I've come to see some stark examples of differences in our state schools and school districts. Let me try to capture just a few examples for you that might help define the challenges associated with providing every child with the opportunity to receive a sound basic education today. The forum's roadmap of need. You can pick up a copy if you haven't already, but the colors are so dramatic. They tell the story without looking at the data. The forum's roadmap of need provides a clear visual depicting some of these stark differences that I saw almost 50 years ago that persist today. One stark difference was financial. That is, the property tax base needed to maintain and supply the schools in the East was generally less than that in the Piedmont. In some cases, there were exceptions where towns and cities formed separate school districts and were able to supplement the state school funding for the schools with special taxes that were derived from a town or city's business wealth. Examples in the East included Rocky Mount, Wilson, Goldsboro, and Laurinburg, many others also. But in most cases, the value of agricultural land was less than business and manufacturing properties in the cities of the Piedmont. Those differences existed in the western part of the state also, especially in some of the very mountainous counties. A second major difference was social. In the Piedmont, blacks and whites lived in separate communities, but typically worked together in textile, tobacco, and furniture companies. There was a distinct social order, but there was also a comfortable, respectful separation. In the East, the social order revolved around agriculture, tenant farmers, and generally white-owned farms where the black community worked. Diversity in the western part of the state existed, but the impact of desegregation was vastly different from that in the East or even in our cities. Finally, I observed political differences. Accompanying desegregation of schools, we were experiencing many other changes. One of those changes was a move from appointed school boards to elected school boards. This change allowed for an opportunity for much more diversity on school boards. In the Piedmont, racial diversity on school boards evolved at the same time as it did with county commissioner boards. In the East, I observed something different. Many school boards evolved to the point that they were made up primarily of black citizens. In contrast, the makeup of county commissioner boards often continued to be primarily white. This, along with private schools that I mentioned earlier, serving primarily whites, created tensions related to funding for schools, especially when property taxes on agricultural land might be raised. The challenges in the West related to taxing farmland for the schools also presented challenges. All of that can be examined more closely through the forum's annual study of school finance. If you have that, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't seen it before, it's revealing. Keith made reference to one important fact related to Orange County and other school districts. Over the past 50 years, we have seen many efforts to correct some of the financial differences. For example, the Federal Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 created Title I and other programs. The Leandro decision in North Carolina recognized the right of every student to receive a sound basic education. And financial remedies such as low wealth funding was legislated to provide targeted help. Interestingly to me, these forces and others combined have led to some districts in northeastern North Carolina having more funding per pupil than the ones in the Piedmont when you combine state, local, and federal resources. So the question becomes greater than money or per pupil funding, in my opinion. It also requires that we look at our history, our culture, and our experiences. In the past decade, much has improved with the emphasis on high school graduation and the special focus on career education through STEM initiatives and other things. At the same time, higher education has come under scrutiny for low graduation rates that some attribute to the rigor of educational opportunity in some school districts and high schools in North Carolina. And finally, most of us recognize that what a high school degree meant in 1950 is more like what a four-year college degree means today. Employers need prospective employees who come with specialized skills as well as advanced education and training. This study group, like the previous 15, is intended to illuminate the issues facing the state related to race, poverty, family, and the conditions of our schools. We have a lot to learn from what has been done before, but today's ideas and tomorrow's solutions will need to be cut from a different cloth. New policies may be needed to be enacted and new programs created to address the ways systems respond to today's financial, social, and political challenges. That's why you're here, and we're looking forward to what we see next April. Thank you.
My thanks to Keith for having welcomed you. I'm always nervous about that part of a program because a little while ago I was invited to Central Prison to speak to the inmates, and I began by saying, "It's nice to see so many of you here." I felt a little nervous about that until as I was leaving, one young man came up to me and said, "You know, now that you've been with us, we feel like you're one of us." I really do hope that'll be the case, for I am indeed one of you. And I thank Joe and James for identifying us, Mike, because as I was walking through the parking lot, one lady came up to me and said, "Denzel, I didn't know you were going to be in town today." So I am happy that you know I'm not Denzel. I bet you knew that anyhow, didn't you? Two things I'd like to call your attention that will be challenges in the study. Most studies of which I've been a part, that would be a plethora. I don't even know the number, having to do with improvement of education over the last few years. But most have isolated on the children, looking at the children. And that has some value. But it's intriguing to me that if we were to go down to the Neuse River today and find fish lying around the shore dead, we wouldn't spend much time studying the fish. We would study the river to find out what is killing these fish. If we were to walk out here and birds were falling out of the sky, we wouldn't spend much time studying the bird. We'd try to find out what is there in the environment that's killing birds. I'm not aware of any instance in which we have actually undergirded that which is causing the lack of some of the things that everybody has identified as being wanting in the educational process. I hope we're not going to spend the rest of our time talking about what's wrong with education. We already know what's wrong with education. We don't need another study to tell us that. What we need to do is investigate what can be done about that and how we can move together as a community and as educators and everyone else who has a vested interest in education, and that is all of us, and cure some of those maladies. Now, one of the understudied things has to do with attitudes. And I'll just mention two sets of attitudes that do accrue to what eventually is the product. The first set of attitudes is the attitude of a community toward the entity called education. It's very easy to find a disconnect between school and community. And when you have discontinuity between school and community, you will not get the best result from either. I've been privileged to have studied about 3,500 entities around the country in which the disconnect between school and community manifests itself, and the victim would be the children. And in instances where you have one of the functions that create that entity is the fact that we take too narrow a sample when we evaluate the process of education. We take too narrow a sample. We look at student behavior, we look at student response, we look at all that sort of thing. If there is an attitude in a community that is negative toward education, now there will be some who will get an education in spite of that. But the majority will have a very difficult time doing so. Mike gave you a little of his background. I'll give you just a little smattering of mine. I grew up in the town of Winton, which is in Hertford County, and I believe it is among the less progressive counties by outside definition that you would find. I declare to you I have as good an education as anybody I've met, and I declare to you that that was not because of any brilliance on my part, because I'm at best average, but it was because it was unaccepted that you would not attend school. It was unaccepted that you would not excel in school. Now, we didn't win a lot of ball games. We played a lot. We didn't win a lot of ball games. We didn't have a lot of fanfare. We never got in the newspaper. But we were nothing but a mass of academic proficiency in our own mind, and that was the nomenclature of the little town of Winton. Now, there was reason for that. One of the reasons was that the cultural assumption there was, I lived on the riverbank. Those of you who don't know about the riverbank, right on the Chowan River, unless you live there, then it's the Chowan River, that runs through Winton. Every day, Dad would say, if you want to get off this riverbank, you see, the motivation factor that we had is a very different motivation factor. Most of the kids I know who are 18 years old never hit a lick at anything. They have no reason to think education would be a propellant because life is so good for them right where they are doing absolutely nothing worthwhile. And having no horizon that suggests that you ought to do something worthwhile. You believe until you're 35 years old, your mom and dad are going to take care of you. You all know what I'm talking about. Your children come back home looking for you to send them some more money after they graduate a PhD. So we didn't have that. I mean, it was well known. If you're fortunate enough and you get out this high school with mostly A's, maybe a B here and there, somebody's going to want you to come to their college. And somehow or another that's going to happen. And when you finish that college, boy, it's no limit to what you might do, achieve, become. That incentive is not there now. It's not there anywhere. I've been everywhere. It's not there anywhere. But it's less there in the rural areas of North Carolina because nobody's shaking peanuts anymore. Nobody's priming sand lugs anymore. There's no incentive to get out of here in the sense that the motivation factor was for those children. So the attitude of the community was, we got to get our kids educated so they have a chance. And you had no option about that. Now, that was fact one. Excuse me, but fact two is more important if you were to qualify, and that is what we believe about our children. If you believe as a society that our children are lost, I was talking to someone just yesterday. I met with the Dudley Flood Fan Club yesterday. 4 of the nicest ladies you'll ever see, and we're like, and they were asking about why the lack of motivation seems to be prevalent among our young people. And what I was looking at here is that when you do not expect your children to do this, that, the other, somebody says to me, they won't do that, so why do you think we ought to ask them to? They won't pull their trousers up. They won't take their cap off. They won't, all these things. When education was working for African American poor children like me, there were a plethora of no-nos, not rules. We didn't have any rules at my school. We had no-nos, inculcated things you just don't do. And I still, to this day, hear them ringing in my ear. And everybody who grew up in that environment hear them ringing in their ear because you just don't do that. You're at C.S. Brown School. You just don't walk in the room in front of the girl students. No, that sounds dumb to you now. But going into education where 80% of people are women, I've been late for a lot of things, just waiting for all the women to get in the room first, because the inculcation factor is non-removable. I mean, you can't eradicate that. It's a part of who you are and what you do and how you feel and how you think. So when there was a belief about children, that all children, given an opportunity, can succeed, my God, when I was principal at Bethel, and I'll conclude with this true story. Some of the true stories I tell, I make them up, but this one really happened. Had a young lady named Maggie. I won't give her first name, her last name. She's still living. And she was teaching advanced biology at Bethel Union. And we were at that time grading and classifying children by having used the norm reference achievement test. You all know about that. And then we would have Division I and Division II and all that stuff. And you were in Division IV. Only way to get out of that is either you die or your teacher die. You'll be in Division IV. I gave Maggie Division IV and said, "Won't you teach advanced biology?" Well, at the end of a quarter, I checked, and Maggie's kids had all made A's and B's. And I went to her and I said, "Maggie, what in the world did you do in that class to get these kids to perform that way?" And she said, "Are you kidding? You gave me the best kids in the school." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Look at this sheet you gave me the first day. IQ 120, 118, 106. I said, "Maggie, that's their locker number." That we had lockers out in the hall. And I had given her the locker numbers, and she thought she had children who ought to succeed. So what happened? She did what a good teacher does. You teach to the expectation you have of the crowd you have. It's the same thing with speaking. We're talking to you based on who we know is in this room. I wouldn't be saying this same thing in some settings because the expectation of comprehension might not be quite as high as it is here now. I would be standing right behind this mic with all my buttons buttoned and me some notes down here and all that sort of thing. You see, teaching is not a science, it's an art. And artists apply to the situation in which they find themselves. And if you find yourself in a situation where every expectation is that these people will learn, they believe it, their mamas and daddies believe it. Heck, first year I taught, I had one young man who I had a disagreement with about who ought to be in charge of the classroom. And I called his mother, looking for a favorable response on my behalf. And I said to her, I said, "Mrs. Coppage, I'm Dudley Flood, and I teach your son." She said, "Yes." And I said, "I wondered if you'd be willing to stop by school so we can have some discussion about him." She got really quiet. She came back, she said, "Mr. Flood, I had that boy all last summer, and I didn't call you one time." She said, "Now you have him until June. So what do you think is going to be my success with this young man?" I've got to start with bonding with her to say, "Look, ma'am, you're the teacher. I'm just your aide. And this kid's 16 years old. You've done something right. He's never been to jail. He's never robbed a bank. I need to know what is it that has worked so well with you that he was able to come into my classroom. And if I can apply some of those, and by the way, if I have any success with him, I'd like to share that with you." See, this collaboration between school and the rest of the world is the only hope we have, my friends, of getting education to where it is. If we miss that, we're spinning our wheels.